Trails and Ghost Towns. Share the adventures of our early pioneers as we explore the development of the Pacific Northwest and beyond. With your host, Mike Roberts, and historian Bill Barlee.
Welcome to Gold Trails and Ghost Towns. I'm Mike Roberts, and with me is Bill Barlee, our storyteller today. But today's program really is about artifacts of probably the greatest trading company the world's ever seen.
I think so, Mike. I don't think that's an overstatement, really. We're talking about the Hudson's Bay Company, the only company that really has been in business for over 300 years.
1670?
Founded in 1670, and they were the gentlemen adventurers trading out of Hudson's Bay.
Gentlemen adventurers.
Sure.
So, how did they get that name?
Well, because they were originally, of course, Prince Rupert was the head of the company, and he was from the royal family, and all of his directors were gentlemen in the original term. And they were called, of course, the Honorable Company as well. And very famous company, the only company allowed to fly the Red Ensign with the company letters at the bottom. HBC, Hudson's Bay Company.
That's magnificent. Yeah. And this flag actually flew over a Hudson's Bay Company somewhere. Store.
That's right.
Okay. Now, it started, I guess, small because nobody knew how big North America was at the time, but it grew.
Yeah, but it was very well funded. You know, it was funded by the royal family. And, of course, they started out of Hudson's Bay. All those rivers and creeks draining into Hudson's Bay. That was their original. But as the company grew and as the competition grew, of course, the Hudson's Bay Company began moving west. And if you look at this particular map, Mike, very interesting map, because this shows Canada in about a little over 100 years ago, and most of Canada, in fact, practically all the west, is divided into Hudson's Bay Company districts. So that the Hudson's Bay Company essentially owned most of Canada.
And explored it. Without them, the exploration of northern North America would never have occurred.
Some of the finest explorers that Canada has ever seen.
All right. Today, the Hudson's Bay Company and some of the most remarkable artifacts we've ever had on the program are on the program today. So don't go away. Hudson's Bay Company right after these words. Welcome back to Gold Trails and Ghost Towns. Mike Roberts with Bill Barlee, and today we're going to take a look at some wonderful treasures, artifacts of the Hudson's Bay Company and another trading organization. Listen, the thing I think about is the concept or the phrase fur brigade is used all the time. Was that only applied to Hudson's Bay Company or was it applied to others?
Well, more to the Hudson's Bay Company than any of the other companies, although some of the American companies had fur brigades as well, the Astorians, the American Fur Trading Company, XY Company to a degree. Not as much their greatest rival, which was the Northwest Company. Now, the Northwest Company were certainly the great rivals of the Hudson's Bay Company till the amalgamation in 1821. And besides the Hudson's Bay Company had other rivals, individual rivals, which were the free traders. These were the so-called mountain men, Mike. And they would trade. They would go into Indian territory and trade with the various Indian nations or the various Indian tribes.
But the concept of a fur brigade, that was a team of men sent out to the Indian people to exchange trade goods for furs.
Well, not really. That was either packing the furs out after the trade season or the goods in. So that's really what the fur brigade was. And of course in British Columbia there were a number of fur brigade trails and a number of fur brigades.
A lot of them through the southern part of British Columbia.
Sure.
But this is what primarily they were after. This is what started Canada. It's why it's on the nickel.
People would call that a beaver pelt. It's a made beaver, Mike, is what it is. And this is one of the standards of, one of the items of trade on the Hudson's Bay Company standard of trade. So in other words, if you had a made beaver, Mike, what you would have is this. You would get this particular coin for a made beaver. And it says HB EM
one half
NB. NB. Now that NB is supposed to be MB.
For made beaver.
Made beaver. But the company that struck these particular tokens actually made a mistake. Well, that didn't bother the Hudson's Bay Company. They figured they'd go along with them anyway.
Sure, we'd had them struck. Sure. If there's a spelling error on them, who's to know?
That's right. These are the mistake tokens, and they're old ones, Mike. They're over a century old.
So when the Indian trapper presented this to the factor of the Fur Brigade fort, was he be given this in exchange?
Yes, he would be probably given the larger one, which is one made beaver if it was complete pelt. And if he brought in a number of other small pelts, and there were a number of pelts that the Hudson's Bay Company was interested in. And the Hudson's Bay Company, of course, made the famous beaver hat from some of these pelts.
Oh, this is what it eventually turned into. Somehow I thought it would be a beaver coat, but
well, they did make beaver coats as well.
But look at this is a lovely thing. How much would that be? Have cost a gentleman of England to back about that?
Well, they started dealing with those in the late 1700s and the 1760s, 1770s, 1780s. By 1820, it had kind of passed the fashion, and that would be very expensive, some pounds in English coin at that time. And when you think an average workman made probably a penny a day or 2 pennies a day, this would be a very expensive item of apparel.
But it was the beaver and the beaver hat and the beaver apparel which started Canada on its way.
Sure, this set the empire in motion.
Now, what could your average fur trapper buy with his half beaver? What would he be picking up?
Well, Mike, he'd be picking up an Indian, of course, would like this.
Yeah.
And that is called an eye dag. Now, if you look at it, this looks like an eye.
Yeah.
And this came in various sizes, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on. That particular one came out of Fort Yale. That was from the original Gus Milliken collection.
So this is what size? I'm sorry, I wasn't paying
attention. I think
attention.
That's a number 1. Now, some of them are that may be a number 2, a 1 or a 2.
But the bigger the number, the bigger the eye dag would be. And so he'd be able to buy a metal axe. And this was far better than any stone axe he might have had.
Well, yes. You see, a lot of people think that the Hudson's Bay Company took advantage of the Indians. I don't think that's the case. And Indian scholars, as well as white scholars, indicate that it was probably a fairly good, it was an offsetting agreement. In other words, the Indians, for instance, couldn't make a musket, Mike. Mm-hmm. And here are 3 muskets. Now, you can take them in order.
One?
Just take them in order. Now, here's one that this is an originally American Army musket, and it's percussion cap. But the Indians liked, of course, the
Put the
brass tacks on the side,
on it.
And they embellished the rifle stock and so on the butt with brass tacks. Hudson's Bay Company usually provided the rifle and also provided the brass tacks, and of course the Indians couldn't make a rifle.
Yeah.
And so this was they felt was fair trade.
Do you know how many beaver you'd have to get a rifle?
Okay, it varied. Sometimes 10 made beaver, sometimes 12, sometimes 14. Depends how much the competition was in the particular area. Yeah. And the idea that the Indians had to pile the made beaver pelt up to the top of the end of the rifle was probably erroneous assumption.
So that wasn't the case.
No, not usually.
Okay.
No. This may be in the case with the free traders who tended to take advantage of the Indians.
Yeah. This looks like a more utilitarian, but certainly useful, still able to kill game.
Yeah, that's a Ketland, and a Ketland is quite a well-known trade rifle, made in England, of course. Yeah. And but it isn't and that's also a percussion cap. But the next one is the most famous of them all, Mike.
This one here.
Yeah.
And this one has got a wonderful piece of brass work, and that explains why they called it what they did.
Sure. This is a Barnett from the Penticton Museum, and this is the brass serpent side plate, and it became the standard of excellence for the Indians. When they saw a rifle with a brass serpent on it, of course, they knew this was a Barnett. It was probably made by the Hudson's Bay Company, and they felt that was a very, very nice firearm. Now, the downside of that was is that some of the more unscrupulous trading companies then began to manufacture the brass serpent side plate and put it on rifles that were not as good.
The old imitation factor, counterfeiting.
That's right, counterfeiting or spurious specimens. And of course, some of these rifles would blow up and maim or blind the Indian hunter. So, but the Hudson's Bay Company, generally their goods were excellent goods. And sometimes they went right into items, for instance, that's out of Fort Yale.
This is kind of is this a luxury item, a trinket item, or how? It's part of the Indian culture.
That's standard, sure it is. Yeah, but that is a lead inset. So you know that's made with a soapstone and then a lead inset, and so the Hudson's Bay Company would have that made, and they'd bring it back to the Indians to trade to the Indians. So the Indians smoked this type of pipe, and the whites smoked this type of pipe. So the
mini meerschaum here.
Sure. So the servants of the company who were working for the company, and they worked for the company literally round the clock, they would
duty
smoke
24 hours
oh,
a
yeah,
day.
sure they were, and they would smoke that type of
Now, would they buy this type of tobacco?
Yeah, that's a carat of tobacco. Very rare because the original label is still there. A little bit tattered, Mike, but probably around 100 years old or perhaps a little more.
1/2 pound. Product of Quebec, I'm amazed to see.
Yes, grew the tobacco in Quebec. And as I say, that's a carat of tobacco. And so the Hudson's Bay Company, they had a wide variety of trade items. They would trade something like...
Well, it's no secret that they're still a department store today because they started out as the nation's first department store.
Well, sure. Yeah. They were the department store of the past. And when you look at some of the great Hudson's Bay forts, and, you know, there were a number of, first, the majority of the forts were around the perimeter, the western side of Hudson's Bay. And then, of course, Fort Garry became really the headquarters in Canada for the Hudson's Bay Company. London, of course, back in England. And then they began to spread west, and some of the western forts, Mike, were significant. Fort Edmonton, for instance, was one of the great, I think the greatest fort in what is now present-day Alberta. And of course, in British Columbia, we had a number of other forts. We had Fort Victoria, which was one of the major forts, and in New Caledonia, which is the interior of British Columbia, at Fort St. James. Other forts were significant, Fort Kamloops, of course, and a lot of these forts, in fact, if you look around, Mike...
You got it here?
Yeah, oh, there it is.
This has got Fort Langley and Fort Yale.
Yeah.
And this is a wonderful thing to have anyway, because this is a page out of Harper's Weekly.
Yeah.
And do you know who the artist was who did this particular work? That is Fort Langley on Fraser's, with a Z, Fraser's River.
Sure.
And it shows the palisade. Did they really have a palisade, or was that sort of European artist's license?
Now, this is very interesting, because the first one of these sketches was done on the spot. That's Fort Langley.
Yeah.
And that's the way Fort Langley looked in 1858. But the second one of these sketches was done through the artist's imagination. He was not at
He was
Fort
never at Yale?
No. If you know Yale very well, you'll see
This
that...
looks like a concrete walled fort.
Yeah, it does. He just took a guess at that. And so Harper's was able to pass that off. And I imagine he got some comments on his lack of reliability.
This is the Hudson Bay flag on that one?
Yes, of course it is. So you had a number of forts, and all these forts were interconnected. And the interesting thing is, Mike, is that the major forts had a factor.
He's the manager.
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah. But the minor posts, that would be places like Similkameen Post and so on, would have a trader, just a trader. But the factor was really the law in that particular part of the country. Now, he may not have been the law to the Indians, but he certainly was to the servants of the company, and they referred to the workers of the company as the servants. And for instance, in Yale, which we've just been discussing, one of the servants of the company, that is, one of the employees, deserted one of the brigade trains.
He was horse packing operations.
That's right, and this was not done. So the individual in charge, probably a trader, had him hunted down. When they hunted him down, stood him up against a tree and shot him.
So you didn't leave the Hudson's Bay Company.
No, you really didn't.
At your peril, you left it.
Oh yes, it was life and death. In other words, if they were, you couldn't have that on a fur brigade, because sometimes those fur brigade they went through very, very treacherous territory, and you couldn't have people leaving at will. So this was an example to other individuals who worked for the Hudson's Bay Company.
How were these people paid? Was there any particular benefit to working as a Hudson's Bay, a member of the brigade, a packer, I guess, an oarsman? I don't know what jobs they had.
Usually paid varying from area to area. For instance, in British Columbia, they usually got 1 salmon per day and some other goods and so on. And at the end of the year, they would get a certain small wage. Now, the factor himself, that was different. If his area did well and the company showed an overall profit, then he was paid extremely well. And some of them retired in considerable wealth, in fact, after working for the Hudson's Bay Company.
Did these guys just sit back, say, in Fort Kamloops and just sit there and count the furs as they came in, or did they actually send out and sort of stimulate trade with people?
Oh, sure. They had to, Mike. They really had to, because what was happening, of course, as the years went on, especially in the early part of the 1800s, so the early part of the 19th century.
Competition
that's
years,
right. There was terrific competition in the West before the run on beaver hats went out of style, really. And so they had all sorts of problems, and they would have to send out emissaries into and have good relations with the Indians. I mean, the Indians, they would carry the Indians, for instance, from year to year, and the Indians honored
this. Is it like
this.
a credit?
Sure it was. Sure it was. And if you see some of their standards of trade and some of their lists of individuals, they'll name the Indians and what he owes them the year before. And I don't think they became indentured, but it was an honorable agreement. The Indian realized that was if he took a gun and he took a certain amount of powder and he took, we'll say, a flask like this or something else, Mike, he owed for that, and he had to bring in the various pelts to pay for it.
Now, it would strike me that something like this would be one of the most precious possessions of an Indian person. Is that the case?
Yeah, I think probably varied. The gun was first and foremost.
Yep.
And then the parts of the gun and the accoutrements of the gun, which would be a flask, you see,
yeah.
and the powder, and so on and so forth. But a lot of things come into play. For instance, those are actually, people refer to them as pots and so on. They're actually a trade kettle. They're a nesting kettle. And what they varied from, Mike, is they varied from, I have them in my collection, right from 10 gallons right down to about half gallon.
So that would be the little one. This is maybe even...
This is interesting. This is interesting because I can tell you a story about it. I was just down to see some people I've known for a number of years, 35 years, the Parsons family. And Doug Parsons, who is deceased now, but he ranged through that southern country of British Columbia, especially the desert country. And this is many years ago, of course. He came across one of these pots and looked at it, looked inside, and there was something white inside, pulled it out. Guess what it was?
Yeah.
Scalp.
A scalp?
Blonde scalp.
In a trade kettle?
Sure. No, so they didn't use
Not
it
the usual thing.
just for cooking. I mean, it wasn't just for cooking. And and the interesting thing there is because generally speaking, you don't think of the British Columbia Indians as taking scalps. But in the Smilkameen district, they did. And another thing that's kind of interesting, and that 10 gallon, which I didn't bring because it's just too big.
That would be just so wonderful.
Well, yeah. But
because hard to find good brass. Yeah. This is just wonderfully heavy.
Yeah. Made in Waterbury, Connecticut, actually, made by the Americans. So a lot of their trade items came from around the world.
Yeah. What do they do in a 10-gallon trade kettle?
Well, first of all, the obvious thing they'd boil in there was buffalo. But the other thing, and they're kind of an interesting story, Mike. Some years ago, well, actually, a century and a half ago, a bunch of free traders sat down, and there's a big 10-gallon kettle, and they sat down, and the Indians proceeded to feed them. And they were very hungry, and it was marvelous meat, absolutely marvelous. And they proceeded to have a second helping, and some of them a third helping, and finally said after the meal, and looked around, and they said, that was very good buffalo meat. Not buffalo meat. Well, it was very good meat. What was it? They're getting a little anxious about this. Dog meat. And they looked around the campfire, and of course there were no dogs to be seen, because every time they needed one, they just grabbed the dog and without the,
dispatched it swiftly, and it
cut
became
its throat, skinned it,
haute cuisine for the free trader.
Sure.
So your 10-gallon trade kettle could occasionally be for dog au jus.
Sure. And the other thing I find very interesting about the Hudson's Bay Company.
I wonder how much of this stuff got, used to get more than one pelt out of your native person. This is, of course, I guess Hudson's Bay rum, right?
Well, yes, that's true. But generally, the Hudson's Bay Company was. If you follow the history of the Hudson's Bay Company, they were much more careful than the free traders out of, we'll say, forts like Slide Out and Whoop Up and so on, those free traders in southern Alberta who served the Blackfoot Indians. Yeah. So the Blackfoot and some of the other tribes would only let in the Hudson's Bay Company, and some of these tribes were very, 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 very careful of that. So the Hudson's Bay Company, when they did trade liquor, and it wasn't a major item of trade for the Hudson's Bay Company, and I'm not being an apologist for them. But what I like about them, of course, is that almost every one of these has the Hudson's Bay label on it. That one came out of British Columbia.
How many of these do you have?
I have a number of them.
And there's even a larger quart over there.
Sure.
I see that.
And that's a different one, Mike, actually. That one came out of Lethbridge, and this one comes out of Nelson. This is the beehive quart.
Look at that.
Or container, you see.
And that would hold, it's got a 1 on it. Is that sort of
that's
1 gallon?
Yeah.
1 gallon?
Yeah, that's 1 gallon.
And that came out of Nelson. There was a fort in Nelson as well?
Well, there was a Hudson's Bay store there right from the 1890s on.
Now, some of the stuff, what we've seen here sort of looks rustic, but some of this material looks like you could get it in the modern grocery store of today. Sure. Look at that, take those beads off. We want to talk about them in a bit.
Well, this is a Hudson's Bay Company tea tin, and they came in 3 different types. They came in blue, and they came in green, and they came in red. And they came in 3 different sizes, and all 3 sizes are there, Mike. There's another little one inside this tin as well.
These are in beautiful shape. Look
Yeah,
at
they
the
are.
artwork
Yeah.
and everything.
Oh,
Of
yeah.
course, these not only provided the product, you grab the big one out of the bottom.
Sure.
Okay.
Okay.
And then this one comes out like that. And then out of the top. Not
Yeah.
only did this provide the product, but it provided forever the container to keep the new bulk product you bought in.
And the interesting thing about these, Mike, is that at one time, and I would say 20 to 25 years ago, you could pick up Hudson's Bay Company items, and they're very, very commonplace. Now extremely difficult to find, and the reason is the Japanese collectors, who are extremely wealthy, many of them, and the German collectors, who fit into that same category, and the American collectors have all discovered the Hudson's Bay Company artifacts, and it's becoming extremely difficult to get good Hudson's Bay stuff now.
We have to take a break, but we're going to come back and talk about some of the men, not necessarily all Hudson's Bay men, but the men who developed and explored Canada and their association with the fur trade and Hudson's Bay Company. We'll do that right after this break. Welcome back to Gold Trails and Ghost Towns. We're talking about the Hudson's Bay Company, and in very short time remaining.
Yeah.
The men, we've already talked about Sir James
Sure.
Douglas.
Yeah.
I mean, the man who designed British Columbia's legal system and political structure, and there were others.
Well, there were others with both companies. Northwest, Mackenzie, of course, with the Northwest Company. Thompson, after whom the Thompson River was with
Tremendous
the Northwest Company.
map maker,
That's
of course.
right. Cuckoo Synth, the man who looks at stars, he was marvelous. But there are some others who aren't as well known. And one of them, of course, I hearken it back to, is Robert Hunt. Now, he was a Hudson's Bay Company factor in the northern part of Vancouver Island, and he owned that particular cannon
Now,
right in front of us.
You actually have a Hudson's Bay cannon.
Yeah.
How would you describe this? An artillery man, a ballistics man would describe this how?
Yeah, well, he would describe that as probably a 4-pounder, and it originally came off a ship, and it was put in one of the bastions of Fort Rupert, and the Indians in that particular area were a little bit hostile, in fact, very hostile, and to keep them under control, he had a number of cannon. This is one of them. And it was sold by his grandson or great-grandson to a man out of Lever Arms in Vancouver, and he wanted me to buy it, and I bought it about 30 years ago, Mike. So this is very, very nice piece, brass cannon.
The cannon part is original.
Yeah.
The casing that it's on,
The carriage, yeah.
carriage that is on, your dad made for you.
My late father made that for me. He felt it should be on a carriage that looked like the original, so we got an original plan.
Amsterdam, 1866. Is that the ship that
That's
it came
the name
off?
of the ship, yeah.
And I think that would go bang today, wouldn't it?
Yeah, actually, you could shoot that today. You'd have to be a little careful because it's been through a fire, and there's still a number of cannon in that area, Mike.
Yeah.
That Fort Rupert area, which is the northeastern part of Vancouver Island, still has a number of cannon sitting right on the beach, pointing out past the harbor, and where the old fort once stood.
That's very clear. I think it almost got by me. But you're not talking about Prince Rupert. You're talking about Fort Rupert
That's
on
right.
the island.
Yeah.
Nanaimo, of course, had its bastion, and it
Sure.
was Hudson's Bay.
Yeah.
Throughout all of British Columbia, all of Canada.
Great history.
And every time you say it, you said Fort St. James, Fort St. John, Fort Nelson. All of these were forts with the Hudson's Bay Company.
Oh, sure. Marvelous history. I think it's we could probably spend several hours on the Hudson's Bay Company. We haven't got, but we touched on some of their background, some of their history, and of course they continue today.
The Hudson's Bay Company on Gold Trails and Ghost Towns. They didn't mention gold once. Valuable beaver hats, I guess, but no gold. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you again next time on Gold Trails and Ghost Towns.